Another interest of the Impressionists is scenes of everyday life. Like I mentioned in the last video, there's an overlap here between the realist and the Impressionists, but where the realists still tend to concentrate on important scenes or important events, the Impressionists are much closer to what we might think of as like a snapshot today. This scene of everyday life that's not anything important or anything special, or if we look at a painting like this, even really anything that's happening at all. Instead, we just see these people going about their business on a rainy day in Paris. It's more subtle in Caillebotte's work than in Monet's work, but we can see that interest in light and atmosphere, particularly the way the light reflects off the small puddles and the cobblestones in this painting, but predominant here is really that interest in ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. This interest in everyday life is in part driven by photography. As artists struggle to contend with photography, part of the question that artists are asking themselves in the late 19th century is, how do we relate to photography? If we can take a picture of anything and reproduce how it looks exactly, what is our goal as artists? What can we add that isn't present in a photograph? And like Monet, Caillebotte is working on plein air. Again, we can compare this painting to photographs of this same intersection in Paris, and we can see that the buildings and the general look are absolutely correct for the time period. Other artists are also interested in that idea of everyday life, but part of what interests these artists is also the way that everyday life is fleeting. That even if you gather the same people together and bring them to the same place, the experience won't be the same. And we see that in Renoir's The Moulin des Galottes. So the Moulin des Galottes is a dance hall, and we see this group of people here in the foreground. They're drinking, flirting, having a good time. We see the one couple on the dance floor here who seems to have paused in their dancing and they're looking at us. They're also part of the group of the artist's friends that he's depicting here. But part of what he's trying to catch is that one ineffable, never to return moment in time. Again, like Caillebotte, Renoir is interested in these ideas of light, shadow, and color that we discuss with the other Impressionist painters. In fact, this scene with the way the light comes through the leaves of the trees and this kind of dappled effect is very complex in terms of light and color. But really the subject of this painting is very much one that is about that kind of single moment in time. A third painter who works in this style is our friend Edouard Manet. So we saw some of Manet's paintings last week, and Manet is a little bit older than most of the Impressionists. He's about 10 years older than most of them. And by the time Impressionism becomes a movement, he really already has an established career. So we saw some of his works last week, and some of them, like The Luncheon on the Grass and the Olympia, were quite controversial. But by the time Impressionism comes around, Manet has an established career. He's shown his work in the salons, but he seems to be interested in the ideas of Impressionism. This work, which is his last work, he painted in 1882, is considered his most Impressionist work, and art historians argue whether this is because of an association with the Impressionists and being interested in their subject matter and in the things that they're interested in, or if it's simply a decline in physical skill. We know that Manet suffered from likely syphilis and was experiencing a physical decline by the early 1880s when he paints this picture. So some art historians argue that this should really be considered a realist painting, in the same vein as The Luncheon on the Grass or the Olympia, and that this more loose, visible brushstroke that we see here is simply a declining physical capacity. But when we look closely at this painting, we do see many Impressionist styles, and it does also make sense to group this painting with Impressionist paintings. So again, we see this idea of everyday life, So we see a man giving his order at the bar. And one of the things that's quite interesting about this painting is almost the whole thing is a reflection. If we look very closely, we can see along this bottom edge here a gold frame, and that's actually a mirror. And so what we see in the background, all of these people over here, are being reflected in the mirror. The figure here is the background, or the back of the same woman in black that faces us, and presumably the man facing her is us, the viewer, the person making his order. So here again we have all of those Impressionist concerns. Light, atmosphere, a painting that's set not in kind of a studio, but out in the world. We see this idea of capturing a moment of everyday life. So we can debate how much Manet really intended to be an Impressionist versus a realist, but we can see many of those Impressionist values in his later work.